Could it be possible that Blackbeard is the Earth God? If a sun god can have a rubber body and imagination, why can't this god be made of darkness? So thank you so much for the $5 dues, the anime underworld. Really appreciate that. And to answer your ever so important question, I'm not entirely sure where Blackbeard fits into this picture at the moment, both metaphorically and literally, because the mural lays out a pretty clear emu-like figure that we're going to be working towards defeating to bring about the dawn of the world and such. But what isn't even close to being pictured here is the fact that Blackbeard is still almost certainly going to be the final antagonist of One Piece. So if we do go with the god idea, then perhaps Blackbeard is the sea god. Cerberus threw it, thrown out the window, but Kraken maybe. Kraken still works. Although this does lead us to one of the major corrections from the fan translations of the Harley text. In the Second World text, the fan translation said that those who deified themselves after slaying the sun god evoked the wrath of the sea god. However, in the official translation, it just says, man killed the sun and became god, and the sea god stormed, which is almost the complete opposite reading. The first translation made it sound like the sea god was responding to those who killed the sun. They were reacting and went, ooh, don't like that, flood. But the official translation makes it sound more like the god was just doing his own thing alongside those who killed the sun and perhaps even in assistance of, which points suspicion firmly back onto Emu as the main candidate for sea god, as every native Japanese speaker I've approached has said that the official translation of the Harley text is more accurate. The "they will not meet again" to me sounds like the people of the world. The red line splits the world. They will not meet again. The oceans rise and create the Grand Line. They will not meet again. Luffy will break the red line. Surely they will meet again. So I do really like this reading. At the moment, I still am in the camp of it's more likely that we're referring to the sovereigns that the Sea Kings were talking about. But this idea, little by little, is winning me over. And there's no reason why both can't be true. We could be dealing with simultaneous meaning. The way I currently view the history of the One Piece world is that the end of the First World saw the construction of the Red Line, due to whatever this serpent creature is, thus dividing the world in two, and the end of the Second World resulted in the creation of the Grand Line and possibly Calm Belt, as the Sea God did whatever sea god does. Sea god flood, flood god flood. But again, after the end of the First World, the planet was divided into two pieces. They will not meet again. And after the Second World, the planet was divided into 7 pieces. And so they would not meet again. But after the end of the Third World, if the Red Line is taken down in something Grand Line, then surely this time, the two halves of the world that have been removed from one another will meet again in one piece. And something like that. Again, I'm becoming more and more of a fan of that idea. What if Bonney turns all the little kids into adult giants? It's a cool idea, but I think nothing happens because none of these kids have ever been taught to fight battle. What I would love to see, however, is Bonney age up Colin to the point where he actually stands a chance against an adult enemy, because as I keep relentlessly saying, Colin does have the spirit, the drive, and the training of an Elbaf warrior, so that could be a very fun option in the future. I like the idea that the people of the half moon are D, but what could the people of the full moon be? So I wanted to wait for the official translation to clarify this, because I found this line in particular quite clunky in the fan translation, but look, it didn't end up helping all that much waiting. But the Second World text says, those of the half moon dreamed, full stop. Those of the full moon dreamed, full stop. And this could be where a lot of people are overthinking, because I'm seeing a lot of ideas of fracturing the D-clan between the full moons and the half moons, but this line could also just be extremely literal and referring to the people who actually came from the moon, which is all of the Sky people and potentially even the Minks, because they have such a clear connection to the full moon in their Sulong form. But also, when we did see a story that took place on the moon, we encountered the Space Pirates, which are a crew of creatures that look like futuristic space Minks. It could also be a divide in the D-clan, like the Luffy Roger faction as the half moons and the Rocksteady Zebex and the Blackbeards as the full moons, both of whom were dreaming, but we do also have quite literal moon people to consider. Maybe they flooded the earth to put out the endless flame that was burning the land. I see there, that is nice thinking. The First World started and ended in some sort of hellfire, so what the sea god does right is overreact to the problem and floods the entire world to get rid of the fire, trade one problem for another. Although the First World does also end in quote, death and darkness, so maybe going back to our Blackbeard question, perhaps he could be representing the entity of the Earth God, and One Piece is ultimately going to be a clash between Earth, Sea, and Sun, or Blackbeard, Emu, and Luffy. But then again, we also have to find a role for the forest god, which completes the quad complement of gods that were worshipped by the Shandian tribe on Jaya: god of the sun, god of the rain, god of the forest, and god of the earth. So things are looking real good right now for Shandian theologists, although we may actually have 5 gods, because it might not be right to conflate the god of the rain with the sea god, and if the sea god is Emu, then it would be the natural enemy of the Shandians, and thus it would make sense not to worship it. But also the earth god doesn't sound like it was particularly friendly either, what with ending the world that one time. And also the forest god, we don't quite know where the forest god stands. But that leads us to another correction that we need to make from the fan translation, because when it came to the forest god in that, the scan said that the forest god summoned its devils. But in the official translation, what is said is that the forest god tamed demons, which makes the connection to devil fruit mythology in this line a little bit harder to suggest, and in fact, I would be tempted to move away from the fruit idea entirely. It made a lot more sense when the language was that the forest god was nurturing devils, but what we have here is now completely different. The forest god almost sounds a little bit antagonistic, as if it subdued and domesticated the remnants of those who lost the conflict in the first world. Now we know who made the scar on Shanks's face. Is it this Cerberus? You know what? It's been a very long time since this was last said, so it's worth going over again. But Shanks actually got his scar from alleged god Blackbeard, which is another reason why he was once speculated to have the Cerberus fruit, because it wasn't known how he was able to make the slash mark without some sort of fierce Zoan ability. However, during Fishman Island, there is a short flashback of Whitebeard claiming the island as his territory, and in this teeny tiny panel, you can see Blackbeard wielding the weapon that he assumedly used to scar Shanks. This is made a lot clearer in the anime. In the manga, you can just miss this entirely. But the weapon itself is called Tekokagi, which literally means back of the hand hooks. 3 heads with 3 swords almost guarantees in the final fight, Zoro will be fighting Shamrock. That, and Zoro is now trying to become the King of Hell, and surely any respectable King of Hell would need to acquire the Guardian of Hell for himself. But look, as much as I'd like to see it personally, it does seem a bit thematically disproportionate for Zoro to fight Shamrock, especially if Shamrock defines himself as a swordsman, which I imagine would get into the same sort of messy territory as trying to define whether or not Shanks is classified as a swordsman for the sake of becoming the world's greatest swordsman. If Shamrock is, then that's a problem, because Zoro, he cannot lose to him. That would be breaking his vow never to lose again, which against a swordsman, he hasn't. But I also feel like Shamrock's just, too important of an antagonist to be beaten by Zoro, whether it be on Elbaf or even later down the line in the final war. So at most, I would predict a fun Fujitora situation where Zoro gets a brief skirmish with Shamrock before it's interrupted by something else. But just on the sword, it was actually introduced as Cerberus, in the same way that the 5 elders were introduced as their respective yokai and or worm creature. And so that's led to the idea that this wasn't a sword that ate the Cerberus fruit, it is a Cerberus who ate the sword fruit. At the moment, I don't really buy into that because I prefer the simpler solution, and throughout One Piece history, the devil fruit weapons do often get introduced by their names. Fungfried, for example, got a whole introduction box of his own on Enies Lobby, although to be fair, this box did make clear that he was an elephant sword and even stated which devil fruit was being used. However, to continue to be fair, Fungfried was a lot more irrelevant than Cerberus is. Fungfried was more of a fancy costume piece for Spandam. So yeah, why not dump the information there, because there's not going to be a better place to put it. But Cerberus could be different. The exact fruit likely being used might have a more dramatic purpose down the line, but it also opens up the question of if Shamrock's sword is named Cerberus and can become a Cerberus, then can Shanks' sword Griffin transform into an actual griffin? Does Cerberus have multiple pronunciations, or have I been saying it wrong? I thought the C made an S sound. Yes, like Cerberus. But no, you're not saying it wrong. The vast majority of English speakers say it like that now. Apparently, the reason for that has something to do with the Black Plague wiping out a lot of English aristocracy. So common people rose up to fill those gaps and started mispronouncing their own language at the time, which was then made permanent and carried over into the modern day. Like this whole C being a S instead of a K. But Cerberus is a Latin word, and in Latin you pronounce the C as a K. So it's Cerberus. And yes, people are gonna actually me. It does come from the ancient Greek word, which is also Cerberus, but spelled differently and also with a K. And in Japanese, it's also pronounced with a hard K, like our thriller bark Kereberosu. I counted 19 people on the conveyor belt, with a sun giving it to an old emu silhouetted looking figure. So I went back on this and I can also count, and I also counted to 19. So what we're referring to here are these guys mining the energy, which I think represents the Mother Flame, but 19 is an extremely important number because that's the number of kings that came together to form the world government and establish a society on Marijois. There were 20 all in all, but the Nefertari family chose not to go full world government, and so we were left with 19. So it could be a coincidence that there are exactly 19 people contributing to the machine that is this massive kingdom, or it could be an extremely purposeful depiction of the world government as we know it today, which would add evidence to the mural not being a strict representation of the first, second, or third world, but rather all of them simultaneously. And history does this thing of repeating itself, because you can make the argument that everything in this mural is extremely relevant right here and now in the third world, just as much as it was in the first and second. But mate, what about Loki? That's clearly him in the mural. So I don't think it is clearly him, but Loki could fill that space in the eventual prophecy if this is a glimpse into the future as much as it is into the past. This half of the mural especially, I think, is both a depiction of the past and the future, with Joy Boy and his allies going to war against some sort of emu-shaped creature, but also the same thing's gonna happen with Luffy and his allies, and in our future war, this big ol' ancient giant-looking guy could end up being Loki. The blindfold on Loki might just be a design choice, like Gojo in Jujutsu Kaisen. Alright, so I'm not the biggest Jujutsu Kaisen guy, so someone can and probably will correct me on this, but my understanding of Mr. Gojo is that he can see through his blindfold because of his six eyes ability. And the reason why he wears the blindfold is because his sight is so powerful that he needs it to avoid sensory overload, which I think is the exact opposite of just being a design choice. And this is what I was proposing as a similar idea for Loki, that this blindfold is somehow there to contain or dull an ability within his eyes, but like Gojo, still allows him to see through various shenaniganry. Adding my 2 pennyworth, Loki has a non-model devil fruit which allows him to see someone's destiny and can actually change it for good or ill. Named for the goddesses of fate in Norse mythology. However, he has to be able to clearly see the person whose fate he will change, which is why he is blindfolded. Alright, yes, this is the sort of thing I was looking for. So I had no idea this stuff even existed before this comment because my Norse mythology, not amazing and probably never will be. But the Norns are particular deities named after a word deriving from the meaning to twine, as they literally thread fate and can thus shape the course of human destiny. And look, if Loki did have this ability or something similar, I think that would be super exciting, because then we could see how he'd be so confident in claiming the title of Sun God, because he may very well have the power to alter fate to put himself in that position. And if so, this could actually make him the most dangerous possible opponent for Luffy to face, because Luffy has been at many key points in his life completely carried by the concept of fate. He could and should have died tens and tens of times over, but he's always saved by the exact right thing happening at the exact right time, and if Loki were able to change that even temporarily, then that is a very serious meta power that I don't even know how you begin to deal with. American here, question boss, how much did that ambulance cost? Alright, so I had to call an ambulance the other day due to a sudden and debilitating issue right before recording the chapter review for 1138. It was horrible timing. It was classified as a non-emergency call out, which costs about 351 Australian dollars, which is about 218 US dollars. It was a little bit more than that because it also charges by kilometer that the ambulance has to drive, but that's not much, it's a couple of bucks. And I should say that even if it was an emergency call out, then it would have been about 277 US dollars. So I hope that answers your question. One thing almost every YouTuber misses in the mural is at the top. Above the moon and between the text boxes, you can see a couple of other spheres that look like planets. So I can't speak for everyone else, but I definitely miss this. There's so much in this mural, man. And also, my channel artists missed this because they weren't put into the original mural art. But above the moon and between the fancy Harley text boxes, we do see 2 other moons, one of which has a strip running across it just like the serpent in the mural, so maybe some sort of connection there. But these are probably a depiction of the moons that we saw in the model of the world on Ohara. According to the Oharans, the One Piece world has at least 6 moons, and one of those 6 moons even has its own mini-moon. So there's probably more celestial bodies hidden behind the Harley text as well. A theory that I love about this is that Franky is essentially a part of the mural. Franky represents Pluton. He had the blueprints and burned them, thus making him the only one who might, assuming he read them, know how to build it. That would be amazing if right now Franky is standing in front of the depiction of Pluton on the mural. Because we can make out a potential Uranus with the arc and the lightning bolt, and a Poseidon with the fisherman monarch and the fish. But making out a Pluton in this image, that is much more difficult. And I've also wondered why Franky was the straw hat chosen by Oda to discover the mural first. Not that I'm complaining at all. It's amazing to have Franky be at the forefront of something so unusually relevant, but also maybe there's a reason why his eyes were chosen to view this as opposed to others. When Ripley said a kid's dream, I instantly thought about Luffy. Well, just on that. In an interview with Iñaki Godoy, the live-action Luffy, Oda said that the most important thing about Luffy is that he's meant to represent the, quote, ideal child. So Luffy's adventure is meant to follow that path of childlike imagination to its conclusion, which is why the world of One Piece itself is constantly growing, getting more and more bizarre and ambitious to meet that imagination. So I can see this mural being drawn by either Joy Boy or Nika. There's a lot to the mural, and it's surprisingly difficult to discern a time period. But I imagine if this mural was drawn by a child, then it could have been the very first person to possess the Nika powers of bringing their imagination to life, which would mean that everything that's happened in this story and the history of this world would be following the cartoonish plans laid out by a child hundreds, thousands, maybe even tens of thousands of years ago. And the future that we may have to look forward to is one ultimate flashback where we see the creator of this mural innocently scribbling with absolutely no idea about how this is going to change the course of human history.